Welcome to the People Playbook podcast. Today's guest is Stephen Wright. Stephen is the president and CEO of Focus. And what Stephen does is he helps business owners step back from the day-to-day stuff that they sometimes want to step back from, specifically sales, so they don't sacrifice growth. Through his sales independence growth system, he installs structure, leadership, and accountability and lets teams perform without the business owner having to do it all. With over 18 years of experience and a background in marketing and sales systems, Stephen's on a mission to help companies scale with clarity and confidence. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's always nice to hear that intro. You don't realize how much you've actually done until you hear an intro like that.
Yeah, it's kind of scary actually when you kind of listen through it and you're like, really? God, time flies.
You're like, I did that? Let's get to it, Stephen, because obviously I've seen some of the work you've done. I always feel that you're just on a mission to help people, right? And sometimes I'll see when discussing with you, your mind working, and I think sometimes it's saying, hey, that guy doesn't have to be doing this at all. This could be a lot easier for us. So when you look at a company and you think to yourself, what do you think the biggest miscommunication and conception business owners have about building successful sales teams?
Really what it kind of follows up for me is hiring that kind of rock star, hiring that unicorn. I mean, you probably see it too, Jason, but you'll go into an organization and historically, businesses have a sales team, but they've relied so heavily on trying to find that born to sales salesperson. This is someone that just exudes that stereotypical salesperson. And the idea there is if I just find that person, potentially that person has that book of business, we are going to be successful. And the real challenge, however, is finding them, first of all. But let's assume you find them, then you got to afford them. If they're a needle in a haystack, you're going to obviously pay top dollar. But let's assume you can even afford them. So now really what you're running into is, can I maintain them? Do I keep them motivated? Can I continue to compensate them? Will they stay here? And so you can imagine the total stress of putting all your sales success based on hiring a unicorn, that rock star from that perception. And so that's the whole idea here is the misconception is to be successful in sales is to find the right salesperson, where we actually believe it's the other way around. It's finding the actual right sales system. So you can actually plug average people and make them good, and you can actually plug in good people and make them great. And if those great people eventually leave, that's okay. You still have a system to continue to plug people back in and continue to groom and grow salespeople in. So it's turning it upside down. It's not the person, it's actually the underlying system that makes success in sales happen.
Yeah, I love what you said about systems, and because I'm a big believer, and I know you are, systems and processes run business, right? So let's talk about that system. So tell us about the moment where you came up with that idea of your sales growth system, and when did that idea become a reality?
So we've been doing this. We've been helping companies, predominantly business owners, for almost 23 years now. Initially it started more in the business development side of it, but over the years we started to inherit every other member of the sales team, and then eventually pivoted and began calling ourselves a fractional or outsourced sales management resource. But the whole idea of SIGS, the Sales Independence Growth System, really came to the surface when we recognized that owners wanted a more plug and play solution. And the idea here is we can come in there and we can learn everything about your business, and we can literally take over the things the owner is doing in terms of leading and optimizing and growing a scalable sales organization. But again, we were going into these organizations, not necessarily winging it, but we were going into them and just doing what made sense for them. And we started to realize that, no matter what the client was, what they were selling, where they were located, we recognized that there were fundamentally the same things happening over and over and over again. And all we needed to do was identify those and turn that into a plug and play system. We ultimately needed to label it something, and then internally we called it SIGS, a Sales Independence Growth System. And so the idea here is it's easy. If you want to ultimately remove your responsibility from overseeing, leading, and optimizing a sales team, then just implement this plug and play system that we've been doing for all this time, and finally have that structure, that responsibility, that process, and that ability to kind of optimize and scale. So I don't know where exactly it happened, but we've been doing it for a while. But SIGS is probably the most recent iteration that we've done because they wanted that repeatable process time and time again.
Yeah. When you talk about processes and teams, so you've worked with a bunch of companies, over 40 business to business companies in your career. When you look at those companies, is there any specific patterns that you see in underperforming teams, and what are those patterns, and how do you notice that right away?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We talk about systems, we talk about processes, we talk about metrics, we talk about clear strategy. But really, what it comes down to is a pattern. And I don't know if it's just general human nature. They want predictability and they want patterns and all that. But we find it's actually the rhythm of executing a system or a process that determines that success. And what I mean by that is even if we have the sales strategy, the structure, the process, the tools all implemented, it is the little things of continue to ensure that we are having weekly sales meetings, we're having weekly one-on-ones, we're having weekly coaching sessions, we're having weekly pipe drive, we're having consistent, predictable rhythms of analyzing what's working, what's not working, and continue to optimize. And again, as I said, we don't want to just have the systems, the structure, the processes, and tools in play. We need to run it in a predictable, consistent pattern or a rhythm that really drives that success there. So I think just to kind of sum it up, that rhythm piece is so critical for any sales organization to be successful.
Yeah, I like that because what you're speaking about there is a high achieving team, right?
Mhm.
And I have a strong belief that there are high performing teams and high achieving teams, and they're two totally different teams, right? High performing
Yeah.
team, bunch of great people on a team, right? And they're all really good at what they do. High achieving team is how do we all work together and how do we actually kind of bond together to get to that result that we need to. And so many high performing teams, they're great, but they still don't achieve their goal, right? So it brings me back to what you said earlier in our conversation. You said, you were talking about the sales rock star, right? And we've also called it, waiting for that unicorn to come in. Right. So
Yeah.
why is that so risky? So why are so many companies just so discipline in looking for that rock star slash unicorn, and they just don't take a chance on other people that, to your point earlier, good could be great, great could be amazing, right?
Yeah. I don't know the exact answer, but there's a belief that building a system is just much harder. There's also the belief that perhaps this doesn't work for my business. I've heard it before. In order to be successful, we run one of my clients runs a highly technical business. And so naturally you're thinking to be successful in sales, you need to hire and maintain highly technical people. And so this belief that in my business we're different, and because we're different, those systems won't work or those processes won't work, and in fact I need to hire that so-called unicorn, that person that is technical, that person that has years of experience selling, that person that has a book of business that could get going. So I think part of it is just a stigma, but a belief internally. And so for some, we can't break that mold. They're just too stuck in the wisdom that is very unique to their business. But we see it time and time again that, again, even if you were to find that, dime in the rough and bring that person on board, there is still risk because you're paying them, you're trying to maintain them, you're trying to keep them motivated, and you're always questioning, are they going to leave me today? And if they leave me today, they're gone and there is nothing to fall back on. And that's a huge risk. That's a huge stressor, from their perspective. But if your ability to build a system that's repeatable, again, that you can plug and play good people in, if anyone were to leave, you know exactly where the gap is. You know exactly what you're backfilling. You're exactly knowing what the key accountability bullets are and what the so-called strengths that you're looking for. You can plug them back into the system and continue to go on, from that person there. So the risk is not having the system instead of the other way around.
I actually like what you're saying here because if you're turning somebody good into great or great into absolutely amazing by having a system and a structure and a process, you're actually creating better work, better world for them. They actually enjoy going to work because they're seeing the results and they're feeling their own personal growth along the way.
Yep.
And they're probably much happier being at work as opposed to seeing that sales team where there's that one rock star that is, getting all the accolades and all the recognition because he or she is just driving the growth and getting all the awards. But there's probably some people on that team that may not be at their level. But if they have a system and they follow a process and they get the proper coaching, they too can attract some results and get some accolades as well to have a better world.
100%. If you think about yourself, how at any moment in time do you step back and have a check and balance? How do you know if you're on track? How do you know if you're contributing? How do you know where you're, off track and potentially stuck? And so without that level of visibility, without that level of guidance, without that level of support from a system, you're constantly in this uncertainty mode. And I've heard it where people start to question, imposter syndrome. Are they actually good at what they're doing? And so having that check and balance, having that ability at any moment in time to go, where am I at? Where am I need to be? Where's my gaps? Where am I off track? Having that structure really kind of helps with that human nature element of people just wanting to feel safe and
Yeah.
have clarity and feel visibility from that perspective there. And for most organizations, it's not necessarily the number of sales you've created or the number of sales you've closed, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of other points of accountability that are critical or so-called leading indicators to that end game. And so for someone that might not reach the end game for months, it's super critical that they know that they're doing the right things today, that they know in 6 months, maybe 12 months from now, the end game is in sight. And that's
Yeah.
super important because, bang on, that's the human element in all of this is super critical. And again, for people to feel safe, to know where they're at and where they need to improve and what they can do to achieve that, that puts everybody in a very comfortable and in a world where they now feel motivated and supported.
Yeah. Can you think of a time, Stephen, where, you've worked with a specific sales team or rep, or you probably have somebody already coming to mind when I ask this question, but that you thought, wow, they were an underperformer, but based on just applying some discipline, some system structure behind them, what a world of a difference it made. And did they ever give you feedback and say, hey, you know what, this is really meant something for me in my life?
Yeah, two things come to mind. I mean, the obvious for me is we often will enter in a client's environment and we will naturally inherit the sales team they have right now. And
Yeah.
a lot of the clients that we work with are in a small to mid-size, sales arena. And to no surprise, these sales reps are responsible for the entire sales process. They're out there creating demand, being tasked with doing lead generation. They're tasked with qualifying those leads, nurturing them, and uncovering opportunities. Once they have an opportunity, they're responsible for riding it through the sales process, maybe being technical and providing solutions and quoting, and then ultimately closing the sale. And so, without fail, we naturally see people left on their own gravitate to certain areas of that process. Where we see the challenges is if they're great at, let's call it the middle to the back end of the selling process, and they are struggling on the front end. Part of it is, are they clear on their accountabilities? Are they clear on what their role is? Are they clear on what they're accountable for, how they're being measured, et cetera, et cetera? That's one thing. But there's also an underlying talent. There's an underlying desire in all of us. And so, left on their own, we naturally find salespeople will graduate to where they have a desire. And to no surprise, a lot of them are desired. If there's an active opportunity and there's an opportunity to lead that opportunity to close, a lot of individuals sit there at the mercy of things on the demand gen or the lead generating side from that journey there. So a lot of the success that we see naturally is to come in and without even looking at the people is setting up the criteria as to the process, but within that process, being clear on the accountabilities and the metrics, and then taking the people and getting their input on that process and seeing what really resonates with them. We also do some PI assessment tests and we overlay that with what we're working on. And so if I can go into an organization and put people where they not only have a desire to sit, but their strengths are aligned with that as well, that's where we get a lot of great success and we get a lot of response simply just by moving people in those areas. So that's a very high level.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we've also seen it where we've identified the rep that's on staff is not the right fit for that organization because of what we want them to do. And that might ultimately mean that we need to remove that person, either put them in a completely different department of the business or completely remove them from the business altogether. We've seen some great success stories where those reps have come back to us and said, thank you. Thank you for helping me not only identify that I wasn't a good fit in this organization, but thank you for helping me hone in where I should be sitting. And they've gone on to other organizations and they've gone on to be very successful because they knew with clarity what their brand was, what their desire was, and they went out looking for that. And they've done very well in those areas. So it's interesting. I don't believe a person is cut out for every aspect of the growth engine. I'm a big believer of specialization based on the company's needs and accountabilities, but more importantly, people's desires and strengths. And if I can put people in those areas where they fit very well, be it with an existing client or with other clients, I think a lot of good things will come out of that.
I think, yeah, you hit on something so big there because I think as human beings, we don't want to say the word no. So if you ask me to do something as a human being, I want to please you and I want to, specifically if you're my boss or you're my company and whatnot, I want to say, yes, I'll do that or I'll try that and whatnot. But
Yeah.
sometimes when you just say, "Hey, you know what? Like you just said, how about this seat over here instead of the seat you're sitting in? Or how about we go explore this path for you as opposed to this path? Or you know
Yeah.
what? Part of that sales structure, you're really good in this area. How about we hone you in on that area so you don't have to worry about this stuff up front?" Or whatever that seems to be. And I think, and you said it earlier, it's almost a big sigh of relief for them, and they're like, "Huh, somebody else saw it as opposed to just me, and I don't have to feel like I'm being a failure. I don't have to feel like I don't fit in this company. I'm just maybe perhaps in the wrong seat right now."
Yeah, yeah. And I,
Right.
I would think more so today when you recognize that sales is no longer, it's funny, and I bring this up as a side note. I still run into the odd director of sales, sales manager, maybe even business owner that still believes that it's the amount of times a salesperson can make it to the golf course and network as to a leading indicator for success. Nothing else, but it's some version of that. And don't get me wrong, there's a time and place for these networking events and all that. But systematically, when you break down how organizations sell, or what I call today how organizations manufacture a sale, you start to recognize that there are different functions that require different skills. And those different skills have different processes and different accountabilities and different metrics and all that. And so I think once you start to recognize that you can really build a powerful manufacturing engine to how a organization creates sales, you can then get into the realm of specialization, which then ties in looking for the right talent, looking for the right desires. And if we can help people feel that they contribute and it's along the lines with their talents and their desires, it's a win-win all around.
Yeah. You keep on saying that word desire, and I appreciate that because I do believe people and their behaviors, they do have a desire to do well, and they do have a desire to win, right? Nobody gets up in the middle of the day or at the beginning of the day and says, "Hey, you know what? I want to be average today." I don't think anybody's said nobody ever, right? So I don't think anybody that says, "You know what? I think I'm just going to mail it in today." I want to go into structure a bit here. So you're big on the structure, obviously. That's what you do with companies and your systems. How do you go into a sales team, implement the structure, but still allow them to be flexible and human, and still allow
Yeah.
them kind of have that balance so they feel like, "Hey, I'm not just a robot here that's following a step-by-step system, but I'm
Yeah.
still allowed to be me, and I'm still allowed to be flexible along the way."
I mean, the biggest thing we don't do, which is a good thing, is we don't provide scripts. We
Okay.
are not telling the salesperson or whoever we're working with, we're not telling them what to say. We're helping them really understand, what they're trying to get to, but more importantly, why they're trying to get to that position. And we'll have a discussion around that. We'll hear their thoughts. We might hear some of the talking points or share some ideas in terms of talking points, but fundamentally, it's on them. They're going to put their own spin, they're going to put their own brand, their own character into those discussions, which is powerful. If I provide you a script and I say this, that's me. That's not
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And so, at a very surface level, we will provide a framework. We will help those understand not only the what, but more importantly, the why. To a certain degree, the how is really up to them. And we will have some checks and balance to be able to leverage the data to go, is the how working or not? And maybe it's not working. Okay, great. Let's get a little deeper and potentially look at, what is it that you're saying? And we might jump on and review some calls together and go back and forth and give some tips and all that. But fundamentally, people are going to be much more natural and a lot more, let's be honest, a lot more successful when they can put their own brand and their own spin on it. Our goal is to just help them understand the what and the why.
Yeah. Beautiful. You're a coach of baseball, so you've been coaching youth baseball for over a decade now, right? Is there any lateral kind of strategies there that have helped you from coaching baseball to coaching a sales team?
Oh yeah, big time. I mean, two things. And I just look at my sons. I could criticize them and critique and provide feedback all day. I can literally say, go up there and hit a home run. From that standpoint. And maybe the odd time they're going to get that one pitch and they're going to make that one space, one swing and hit it right at the same time, and boom, we got the home run. Chances are it's not going to happen. And so, really, what coaching has taught me is to kind of how to guide without the pressure. This is not dad from that standpoint, but very similar to kind of coaching sales team is if I can create that structure, that framework, if I can also enforce what I call a coaching mentality or a training mentality that we recognize that it's not just going to happen like that, but it's going to happen with constant repetition, building that muscle memory in what we do and working on the fundamentals that will lead to that home run. That's in essence what we kind of not only do with our sons and coaching baseball and all that, but it's really what we do working with sales team. It's the process and it's the repetitiveness of being able to fine tune and tweak that process that will lead to success.
Yeah, it's I talk often about coaching and people want to be led, right?
Mm,
People want leadership, right? So when you're able to do what you do and coach people and just kind of show them the right direction and maybe a different mindset, which is going to lead into my next question, it's amazing what we can achieve. So let's talk about mindset for a second. So your business, you talk about freeing owners of basically running the sales operations, right? So they can scale, right? When you talk to an owner about freeing up their time to let somebody else do that for them, what do you think is the number one mind shift they need to make first by
yeah,
letting you kind of take over their revenue generating team?
yeah.
How does that what's that mind shift look like?
And I think it's also important to note that we're not asking them to relinquish their responsibility. This is their business. They have a lot of value and have reason to continue to contribute from that. Really, what we're asking them to do is to begin to start to delegate instead of abdicate, if you want to put it that way. We're asking them to delegate responsibility, but in order to delegate requires a certain level of trust. And yes, we've been doing this, and I can speak to all the things that we've done in the past and what we do with other clients from that perspective there. But to a certain degree, I have to I have to help clients, and to a certain degree, look for clients that believe that it's the fundamental underlying systems, structures, process, leveraging data, what I call more the science side of selling rather than the arts side of selling. That's the mind shift for many. For those that are still stuck on it's all about the relationship, it's all about, getting out to the golf course and networking. That's still more of an artsy side of selling mind frame. I'm trying to shift those into more of the science side of selling, that system, that structure, that process, that data, that technology driven sales organization. And as I said it before, unfortunately, there are still some that can't get to that level. But many I find see it, especially now with AI and technology being where it is today. Owners are starting to recognize that there's a massive shift in how organizations are structured in terms of sales and growth. But getting them to think like that, to own that side of selling, is probably the biggest mind shift from that perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a hard mind shift for them to get over sometimes, right?
Mhm.
They probably need some, persuading as well to think a little differently.
Just on that note, the art, not necessarily the irony, but the interesting thing in all of this is most of these businesses have made that shift when it comes to the fulfillment side of their business. You go into the fulfillment side and they have SOPs for everything. They have technology, they have key points of accountability and process and all that. You may even go to their financial side and go, man, you guys are really good with your numbers and you have clarity around all that. But when you look at the growth side of their business, it's still a wild, wild west approach. It's a hope and pray. And so the good news is they've experienced these other areas of the business where they put on that structured scientific approach to their business, but they've yet to do it on the sales and marketing side. And that's it's a good thing because you have something to leverage against. But I always find it quite funny that you've done it in all these areas, but why not here?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. For a business owner right now or a sales leader listening to this podcast right now, what's a cue or a sign to let them know that they're not leading the company or the division, they're more managing right now? What would you say they need to look for so they know they're in that grind of managing as opposed to leading?
It's real simple, and we ask this all the time. It's one of our almost qualification questions: is are you still running your weekly sales meetings? Are you still running your pipeline reviews with your sales reps? Are you still chasing deals? These fundamental things that an owner shouldn't be doing. They should be relying, if they could, on a full-time director of sales, but most likely they can't afford it. They should be leveraging someone else to own the day-to-day, in the weeds, working, supporting, coaching their sales team. If they're still doing that, chances are they're not acting as a visionary, they're acting as a sales manager. And we want them to be acting more as a visionary. That's what their business needs. That's what makes their business much more valuable. So we can kind of come in and own that responsibility to run those weekly calls, run those pipeline reviews, coach and support them, support the sales team on their deals. That's what we do. So that's what we would ask: is reflect and look at how much you're in the weeds with your sales team versus how much you're playing in the visionary role.
Yeah. If you look back at your career, Stephen, and think how this all started, what would you say was your why in starting this? So what was the moment that you said, you know what, I'm going to start this. I think I've got something here, and I'm going to go with it. What was your why, and how did it all start?
We saw businesses that recognized that they were big enough, that they needed a certain level of leadership, a certain level of accountability, and ultimately a certain level of structure, process, et cetera, et cetera. But we also saw businesses go, I just can't afford someone full time, and I can't justify having someone full time. And in fact, if I bring in someone full time, we're going to need them to also sell, which is a whole completely different challenge if you're bringing in a leader to also sell. So we saw this gap out there of people really wanting to have that level of leadership, that ability to let go as a business owner, but they couldn't afford it. They couldn't justify it. So they were stuck in this purgatory period. And that's the gap that we started to recognize. Well, just give us the keys. We'll have to build that engine, but let us run that engine. And that's what continues to kind of drive us forward.
Yeah. And last question, because you've been more than generous with your time today. I wanted to talk about, if other than growth, what is the biggest pain point that a sales organization experiences other than growth? So I know everybody, obviously, it's sales. We need them to grow and we want to hit targets. But if we take that out of the equation and we just say, hey, everything's growing, everything's, going really well right now. What's the next biggest pain point that you see with sales organizations and people?
For me, it's very simple: predictability.
Yeah.
Predictability.
Predictable.
You might not be hitting the numbers that you want to hit, but are you able to step back and be able to now predict what's going to happen in the next 90 days? More importantly, are you going to be able to predict the next 6 months, maybe the 12 months from now, based on the patterns and the rhythms that you have? Yes, you may not hit those numbers, but if you're starting to see the patterns and the rhythms and when you do this or you do that, it's going to have this change, positive or negative. That's the biggest thing. And so the focus right now is not growth. The focus right now is to create a system that's predictable, that's repeatable. And as we optimize it and become more scalable, that's what's going to lead you towards growth. And so growth shouldn't be like oh my, I didn't realize this was going to happen. It should be I knew this was going to happen because of what we saw, what we put in place. And that's the whole idea, is to create that predictability in your sales organization.
I love it. And I told a bit of a lie because I do have one more question for you, because while you were talking, I was just thinking. So I always come back with one more. So with my last question, I promise you, is this: is if you had to think of one salesperson that you're most proud of, they come to mind because they just hit another level and something happened in their life because of working with them. What was that thing or moment that happened in their life from implementing your structure and whatnot? And what specifically do you think they improved on the most?
So I won't name any names, but we had a client who had come into the business not by choice. It was a family run business. And there was an obligation that when the father in this situation reached a certain point, that in this case, his child would come into the business and start to take over. This person never had a desire to do that, but also didn't want to, let their father down in the journey. So for years, they were running things or trying to run things. And again, as I mentioned, it was a little bit of a hope and pray, and it was a wild, wild west. And some things would work, some things wouldn't work, but there was no stickiness. There was no predictability, as I mentioned earlier. When we had come in there, we brought in those systems, the structure, the process, the technology. It wasn't perfect out of the gate. We had to build a lot of these things from scratch. But as we started to get the momentum going, we started leading the sales team, optimizing the process. We started to realize those predictability patterns, that ability to start to see scalability. I say all that because it reached a point where that person was able to not let go of the business fully. They were able to step out of being in the weeds day to day, but they were now able to go do what they truly wanted to do, which was a completely different passion. From that. And it was more related in the art side. They had a passion to run a dancing business from that standpoint. And so their ability to go in there and actually start up a dancing business while at the same time still oversee and play a visionary type role in this other business, they were finally able to step out of the weeds and actually go build something that they truly had a passion to drive. That was great. If we can ultimately get people to a point where they go, I can now choose where I spend my time, that's ultimately what we want to do.
With that, Stephen, I thank you for your time today. You've been really generous, giving us some time and some advice and just how people work and culture. So I will let you get back to your day, and thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. As always.